You and I have touched on this many, many times, and we will absolutely do more episodes on it. But retention of your students and your families is the number one issue that you as a founder want to consider and contemplate annually as you're coming up with your priorities.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So you want to reduce the attrition percentage. You want to know how many of your students every month are leaving, while how many students are staying. And that's year over year, month over month, etc., right? So we believe that the most predictive impact you can have on that is by recruiting, onboarding, supporting, training, and retaining amazing teachers.
Welcome back to Seven Figure Music School. I'm Daniel. This is Nate. And in this episode, which is opening the third season, we are talking about the employee-contractor distinction. This is one of those topics that every school owner has to ask at some point in their career. It's one of those topics that comes up frequently in music studio owner and music school owner forums, whether it's Facebook or some other forum. And unbelievably, we've gone over 50 episodes and haven't talked about this yet. And so here's what I want to say right from the beginning. There are going to no doubt be school owners that you've already conquered this mountain. You've already climbed this hill. You've either made the choice to stick with contractors, or because of the state you're in, you're forced to have employees, that sort of thing. I want to say right from the beginning that we're going to avoid the obvious take on this topic. Our goal in this episode is to still make this valuable for you. And to that end, our goal isn't to talk about the IRS rules, what you should do, what to put in your contracts, how to handle the payroll, whether or not they should sign an NDA or non-compete. That's been done to death. The forums are overloaded with questions about that. That same question comes up 2 or 3 times a month in a lot of the places that I look at. Frankly, we have a little desire to do that again. So these topics and our answers on them might come up in a tangential way, but it's not our main focus or purpose. And to be honest, you probably shouldn't be asking other studio owners anyway. Go contact an attorney. We actually, and I know you remember this, but we actually did an episode with my attorney on this topic, and it was so short and to the point that we actually never released the episode. Her answers to most of my questions were, well, it depends on the state, or, I would have to answer that question on a case-by-case basis. Right. Point being, if that even the attorney is saying that it's highly individualized and specific business, you probably shouldn't be asking people like us or going to the Facebook groups for wisdom on that topic. So,
not a podcast episode, no.
Right. So if we're not going to be taking that angle, what are we going to be talking about? And so as Nate and I discussed the opening of season 3, the beginning of a new year, and what episode we want to do first, we realized we wanted to create something that would be valuable to owners and founders who were at every level of experience with this topic. So in diving into this, Nate, let me ask you a question, perhaps just a jarring question right here from the very beginning. The employee versus 1099 contractor distinction, does it even matter? What do you think?
Such a good question. It absolutely matters because of the reason why you're even asking the question.
Okay.
It matters because so often I get asked this question coupled with a follow-up comment. For example, I can't ask my teachers to do this thing I'd like them to do, maybe show up to a department meeting or come to a required recital, because they're a contractor, not an employee. And I automatically answer, why does contractor versus an employee matter? And of course, their answer is, well, because doesn't that stipulate that they have to do it? Well, I always follow with, they're not showing up to their students' recital because they're a contractor. That doesn't have anything to do with it. The foundational question is usually, what's the culture of your company, and why are some people committed and others not to your purpose? So we're going to get deep into the 1099 versus W-2. We're going to get deep into why BMF does what it does with this question. I'm sure I'll share some stories of when we did it wrong versus what got us to do it right. But really, it's a foundational question that you should start with, which is, does it matter? Yeah, it matters because you're asking the question, but possibly for the reason that you're not willing to look at yet.
So what then do you think, Nate, would be the question that they should be asking? I don't even know if that's the right way to go about broaching this topic.
Okay, so the question I'd be asking is, what are you hoping will change if you change the legal structure of your employment?
Okay.
What are you hoping will change for you as a founder and as the employer? And what are you hoping will change in the way your employees act on the job site? Right? Start there, being like, if I make this change, here's what I expect here's how I as a founder expect to think differently. And here's how you as a teacher or a staff member, I expect you to act differently and think differently. Start with that foundational question. Maybe I'll give an example in myself, right? So at BMF, we're in Brooklyn, New York. So getting back to your comment, Daniel, about, how one state is different than another, we're not going to get into any details there, but that's where I'm located. So when I go to my attorney, I'm asking specifically about being located in Brooklyn. However, I have employees that are teaching online, great teachers that don't live in New York State. They live in other states, right? So, of course, that's a question too. However, for me personally, it's really important as one of my core values is that our teachers feel supported as employees within our company. In other words, there's some sort of support system that's backing them, right? And that comes partially from Brooklyn Music Factory and how we treat them and the benefits we offer them, et cetera. But it also comes from knowing that in our case, they're a W-2. Being a W-2 employee, they also have governmental support, right? For example, I want them to know that they have a set number of sick days that are automatic, that they are paid based on the number of hours that they work, right, in any given month. And that is mandated by the fact that they're an employee here in New York State. It's not mandated by BMF, but we would already offer that, or we already did offer some version of that before we even understood the legal ramifications. But the point is less about the details. The point is getting back to my first comment, Daniel, which is like, you as an owner have a set of values that you want to represent by answering this question, right? So you have to start with the man in the mirror or the woman in the mirror or the person in the mirror. You got to start there and ask yourself, what are you representing by making this choice? And that, of course, there's other ramifications. There's budgetary concerns. It costs more to have a W-2 employee. Yeah, it does. Of course, there's other things, but you got to start with your heart. You got to start with you, right? Because you're not going to be a long-term sustainable employer if you're always sort of fooling yourself by the way you act. So ask yourself that foundational question first, which is, what are you most comfortable with?
The thing that I feel like I hear most, or a misconception that I feel that people have, is this idea that, oh man, if these folks were employees, they would be more invested in the business. This comes up on a fairly frequent basis. And that always surprises me, because as I think about even the way that I have worked with people over the past 7 years, we have a few key team members here at Grow, and then we have a lot of role players that don't have a lot of hours every single month. One could almost say that, if you were a larger school, you might have some key teachers that had a lot of hours, and then you have maybe this violin teacher over there that teaches 5 students for you, and this flute teacher that teaches 3 students for you. Not a lot of hours. Probably not going to make that person an employee. From a legal perspective, it probably truly is allowable for them to be a contractor. And again, not getting into the legal side of it. So I think there's a lot of overlap between what school owners, and even my own experience running a summer camp with contractors and a small school with contractors, and the current structure I'm in. And all I would say is this is why I'm mentioning all these things and bringing this point to the fore, is that even with people who are on micro time or part-time, I've never experienced a lack of passion simply because of the legal distinction that the person was in. I hired for the passion. I hired for the suitability of the job. I hired for the culture fit. Whether it was a person who's working full-time for me, person who's working part-time for me, or a person who's a role player, all they're doing is one specific job in one area of the business. Person that comes to mind is the Google Ads person who works for me. There's such investment, there's care, there's teamwork, there's a willingness to be invested in the mission. I see people who are customer facing, people who are on my team that are customer facing. I see them being invested in the customer success, and they're not checking their pay stub and say, "Oh, I'm a W-2 employee, therefore I'm more invested in the business," versus, "Oh, I'm a 1099 contractor, I'm less invested in the business." I think it's just such a false distinction that if I could banish that from the thinking of people, I absolutely would. Obviously, I can't. Obviously, this episode hopefully goes towards that. But Nate, just hearing everything I'm saying here, curious if you have comments on that, thoughts on that. Maybe you want to pontificate on why you think that misconception exists. Maybe you even had that misconception at one point, and you can help me see why people think that way. I don't know. What are you thinking as you hear me talk about all this?
Well, there's a lot of things that come up. The first and most important one is to highlight what you just said, like 3 minutes ago, which is when we're hiring, when you are hiring, you're hiring for a very specific culture fit within your business. Grow, right? Has a very, you and I have become friends over the last few years of getting to know one another and then working together a lot. And so over that time, I've gotten to meet a number of the people that you work with regularly, right? And you have a very specific sort of flow within your company. And one of the things I'll say that is really cool to witness is that you're very much like you've got your systems, they're well conceived, well built, people hook into them. You're very clear about, hey, this is the checklist we use to do the things we do. You're very clear about where you look to see. You're very clear about how you operate as an owner in terms of day in, day out, doing what you do. And what's interesting is what I hear you talk often about is I don't care when you do it. I care to a degree how you do it, but really I just care that it gets done and that we're moving forward. And so there's a whole lot of flexibility within your company that is built in there. And so actually, if we were to change 1099 to the idea of that's sort of the flexible model versus W-2, which is a much more defined model, and I'll get back to why I'm saying this in a moment. But I feel like you do a great job of establishing at the outset, here's how we're going to operate. There's lots of flexibility, but we're very clear on where we're going and the timeline within which we're getting things done. But a lot of your team lives everywhere. You're not asking them to come into a classroom every Monday, every Wednesday, every Friday and teach on this piano using this method. So in many ways, I think you've touched on the most important piece, which is that know precisely what your culture is and how your employees are going to operate within it. And then getting back to the topic of this podcast, the 1099, the contractor versus W-2. Yeah, you're right. Nobody's looking at the check thinking this is better for me, that's better for me, etc. But honestly, you're using that model perfectly. You're saying like, hey, maximum flexibility within my company. And there, by the way, there's a pay structure that matches that perfectly. So if I go to the music school now and sort of continue your thought, I would say if you're a music school that thrives or prides its culture on giving teachers maximum flexibility, for example, they're all doing house calls, they're not coming to your school, they're teaching whatever methods that work best for them, and you have total trust in them. That's part of your culture, is that the teacher teaches her method that she's succeeded with year in, year out rather. Then you want to begin to frame it that way. You want to ask yourself, like, what is the culture of my studio? Now, getting back to the initial point you made, if you're not even hiring to culture, if you don't have a clear sense of whether or not you want methods within your institution that are universal amongst all your teachers, or you're not even asking these foundational questions, then I would say that's 100% where you want to start. You want to ask yourself some of these basic questions around the type of studio you're building. Again, at Brooklyn Music Factory, it's pretty straightforward. We're literally a curriculum development company. We have methods, we have games, we have songwriting party, templates. All of our teachers are all in on all of those methods, right? It's not a totally flexible, do what you want, see you at the recital program. Not at all. Not even remotely close. So that's sort of a good way to begin to wrap your head around it. If you're listening to this, what type of school do I want to build?
Interesting. So let me just ask this question. We started with this question. I'm going to ask it again because I think there's more to answer in that. To me, it would, and I'm just curious what your thoughts on this, Nate. To me, as I look at the distinction, I often see school owners or aspiring school owners or people who are kind of in the early days of scaling up, hiring their first few teachers, kind of wringing their hands over this, have a lot of questions about contracts and that sort of thing. And I feel like there's this fear that having W-2 employees is going to be this onerous burden in terms of cost. But as I talk to school owners who've already switched over to that, some, like a mastermind client of ours who's in California, who I actually talked to before we recorded this episode just to get her take on it.
Yes.
She said that she was forced because of legislation that passed in California a few years ago to do this. And that really, in hindsight, looking back, most of the stress was caused simply by her lack of understanding around what moving contractors to employees was going to do, and that all things being equal, after she did it, it was really just about learning the process.
Yes.
And that it was about, like the cost to employ those people really didn't change all that much. There was some education she had to do in terms of showing people, well, hey, like before you had to pay your taxes, now I'm paying your taxes for you. So your take home might be slightly less, but in the end, the cost to the school and the cost to you is kind of negligible. Okay. So I don't know. I don't know if I even have a question for you, Nate. I just think that there's a lot of fear out there around this distinction. And from your experience, since you do hire your team members as employees, would you say that assessment feels correct? Would you say that more or less it's going to cost about the same to hire those people? It's just the columns the columns in which the revenue is being distributed just look different between those two distinctions?
Yeah, dude. So I love budgeting and planning and numbers. Sure. And so I really appreciate the point that this client of ours in California brought up, because I would say that we fear the thing we don't know. And usually that causes way more stress than just simply acquiring the knowledge and then assessing what to do once you have the knowledge. I would also highlight something here, because nobody's forcing you to do anything. There is no state forcing you to do. That's a classic victim mentality, right? We're choosing to live and open our business in a town, in a state. Well, we don't have to. You could just simply open an online school. You could move to another. I mean, there's no forcing of anything, right?
You can move to Indiana. It's pretty. It's wide open here. They don't
there's
care here. It seems like.
So I just want to let's just. I love it because I remember my coach said to me the other day when I said, I don't know, it's just that now she's making me do this, and she goes, "Stop, Nate. What did you just repeat what you just said?" And I was like, ugh. And she's like, "Who's that showing up? Which saboteur is showing up there?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's the victim." Anywho, sorry, just a little sidebar there, but
I love it.
But I went, dude, we were talking in prep for this, and I immediately went to Leah, who I just adore, who's our bookkeeper, and I was like, "Leah, remind me, what does it cost us to have W-2s versus 1099s? Because we have both. We have staff members that are classic contractors. They work when they want to work, how they want to work, right? They're remote staff. They're not teaching here at BMF. Anywho, she's like, okay, this is what it costs, Nate. It basically is 8% more, right? So in other words, if we pay a teacher $50 an hour, it actually costs us $54 an hour. Dig it? So there's the simple number for you. Now, it breaks out in your budget slightly different. They still just get $50 an hour, but then there's also a benefits portion underneath your cost of labor that's essentially like, your FICA, the insurance, and that's like another, whatever, it's 8% roughly. Now, that changes potentially because your state might ask you to pitch in a little bit more on this thing versus that thing. But basically, that's the number you can run. You can sort of start there, but you can do your own research. That's just a Google away. Okay, so you can budget that any way you want. You can then pay them just a few bucks less an hour to start. And of course, then your recruitment process, you have to highlight some of the benefits of working at your school differently because maybe you're paying a couple bucks less than the competitor. But there's language you can use around that. But I would agree with you. Yeah, and I would agree with you, Daniel, that basically start by facing your fears and get some facts in place. Right? And then from there, assess how you're going to move forward. And so that's my immediate response. I'd say there are burdens, of course, of being a W-2 employer, just like there are burdens, as we've been talking about, to being a 1099 employer. Right?
What are those distinctions from your perspective?
I would say, if you're a 1099 employer, we've already talked about some of those burdens. You have to sort of face this mentality that you're basically gathering a group of freelance educators, right? And you have to face this sort of freelance mentality and be like, how can I build community and culture if everyone sort of imagines themselves as a freelancer? You and I were talking about this a little bit, Daniel, but one of the most pronounced education points for a new teacher coming to BMF is tackling this idea, because a lot of them have not never, but have rarely been anything but a 1099. They've just always thought of themselves as I'm a contractor. I get paid $1,000, and then I have to manage my taxes, once a year. I have to write everything in the kitchen sink off, and then try to pay as few taxes as possible, right? So that's just a whole sort of mindset around. I've got control over my life as a freelancer, and it's just moving. I'm moving from one hustle to the next hustle to the next hustle to the next hustle, and I'm figuring it out as I go along. All good. It's gotten me this far. I'll keep going. So that's one of the burdens of bringing on, if you're employing only 1099s, is you're constantly managing that mindset. And honestly, for us, one of the conversations that we have, Daniel, at the outset is like, hey, now you're coming on, especially when someone comes on as a full-time salaried or a full-time W-2 employee at BMF, we say, hey, here's the deal. I recognize that this is probably one of your first full-time gigs, because they always want to know exactly how many hours am I going to work? When do I work? When don't I work? Etc. And that I recognize from my own story as being a freelancer for so many years of my life. And you have to sort of be patient with them and be like, look, here's how this works. You're going to do a bunch of hours that are going to be on the calendar where you're teaching. And then there's going to be a bunch of hours that you still control on your own, where you're going to report those hours and get paid for them, but you're going to be creating curriculum, or you're going to be showing up for these essential training meetings, your one-on-one check-ins, etc. All of these things we value equally. And so you're sort of chipping away at that mindset. Now, back to the burdens. The burdens of being a W-2 employer are that you also, there's paperwork. You can't miss your insurance payments to the feds and to the state. You miss those, and you start getting mean letters in the mail that none of us really can understand how to read, except for we owe something. You're like, I don't even know exactly who I'm paying when I'm paying the New York State Insurance Fund. You have things like, there's like if you have employees that are working, 30, 40 hours a week, teaching and otherwise, well, it's mandated that they get a certain number of sick days every year, and you have to track those things. Now, here's the good news. There are now so many tools, softwares that just make this stuff so much easier. Like we use Gusto to manage all of our payroll and all of the taxes and all of those things. And it's not like a silver bullet. You don't just sign up and all of a sudden magically everything's working. You do have to learn it, just like you had to learn how to use your Gmail and your Slack and anything else you're using. Well, but the fact is, we now live in an age where your issue with bringing on W-2s or managing employees effectively, guess what? There are millions of other small business owners that are doing the same thing and having the same question, and now have found a solution that's sustainable for them. So that's the optimistic outlook for us, that those burdens that we're feeling, there are solutions. You're listening to someone who once felt stressed about it, and now we have a solution to where payroll's running every 2 weeks, taxes are being paid, insurance is being paid, etc. So it is possible.
I don't know, Nate. Should we wrap back around to maybe what kind of kicked this episode off, which is that deeper heart and soul, or do you feel like we've covered that already? Because I feel like the thought that really intrigued me about actually doing an episode on this, even though we tried earlier with my attorney and we were just like, let's not cover the legal angle of this. The thought that intrigued me was just your comments around maybe what's more important than the distinction is the building culture piece. Or like, do you feel like we already covered that in sufficient detail?
Let me zero in on something that's really essential when we're getting our pay and benefits piece correct, which is that you and I have touched on this many, many times, and we will absolutely do more episodes on it. But retention of your students and your families is the number one issue that you as a founder want to consider and contemplate annually as you're coming up with your priorities. right? So you want to reduce the attrition percentage. You want to know how many of your students every month are leaving, while how many students are staying. And that's year over year, month over month, et cetera, right? So we believe that the most predictive impact you can have on that is by recruiting, onboarding, supporting, training, and retaining amazing teachers. I'm going to say that again. Recruit, get your hiring funnel, improve that. Then hire, onboard them effectively so they know the team that's supporting them, staff, who does what, why, when. Basic things like when do they get paid, how do they get paid, how much do they get paid, why do they not get paid for that thing. That's all part of onboarding. Then training and supporting them in an ongoing way so that they feel like they're part of something greater than themselves. They're no longer an individual teacher seeing a piano student, but they're part of a community of teachers that are supporting that piano student. And then retaining those great teachers for 3 to 5 years. That's the average of BMF, right? We'd love for 5 years to be the time, but that's 3 to 5 years is a good average for us. Okay. So when we talk about getting your culture piece together, I want you to consider your pay and benefit structure around what I just said. Hiring, onboarding, training, supporting, retaining, and know that if you put in the time and effort over the next couple of years to refining your pay and benefits package to a teacher and getting them very clear on what that 3 to 5 year path looks like for them, all the different earning opportunities, how they're going to get paid, when they're going to get paid, etc. The 1099 to W-2 is just a microscopic piece of that. If you do this well, you ask lots of questions, you reach out for help, you're not shy about being, dumb on some subjects, smart on others, right? It's okay. There's just really no dumb question around this. You ask your friends, you ask your network, you email Nate or Daniel, you just reach out to anybody. If you do this, at least at BMF, we believe that your retention issue will improve. Okay. And that we're just going to go on a record right now as saying, we had Jeff Homer here on an episode last season, and he said it. Let's be honest. What's the number one issue? Retention. And he was talking about family or student retention. Yeah. I'm going to extend it to teacher retention. So that's the last thing I want to say around this culture piece, because we're really zeroing in on a human being that you want to be part of your community that's going to support the purpose for 3 to 5 years. That human being they have needs just like you. They need to understand how they're going to put one thing they need, which is dollars, into a bank account so they can do what they do. And you need to be clear on that. That's our job as a founder. That's our job as building a community of great teachers. And it's not an easy one. So don't confuse my comment with thinking, I'm going to nail this in the next 2 months, right? It's a contemplative issue that becomes an annual priority. And then you put in the time and attention over the next 12 months to trying to get it accurate and clear.
So maybe I was being a little unfair earlier in the way I introduced this episode, because at a certain point, it is really important to ask the tactical questions around this. And so there is a time and place for that. But what it sounds like you're saying is that after you have done that research, which is a moment in time,
yes,
your thinking has to return to what business is truly about, which if I could sum it up in one word that you said there, it's predictability. That the foundational elements that have to be in place for a school to deliver on its promise year after year is predictability in the marketing piece, in the product delivery piece, in retention and attrition, leads and conversions, cost of labor, operating expenses, marketing budget, year over year over year over year. If you can predict with accuracy what those things will be, you actually have a business, not a child that has to be babysat. That's unpredictable, and you never know when it's going to break its leg and you have to take it to the emergency room. Man, I'm really stretching the bounds of this analogy. Point being that this distinction is important, but actually, no matter which structure you choose, it is only going to be one tiny factor in the overall. It's only one tiny piece of the overall thing, which the CEO / owner / founder should have in their mind all the time, which is the predictability in some of these larger categories that we've been talking about since December of 2021.
Yeah. And I think you're right. And I like the parent analogy, actually, the child parenting analogy, because remember, we hear this all the time. I mean, we're both parents. It's like you think you know your kid, and then when they're 5, then they're 9, and they're like writing you these short little, they're writing you like love notes and everything. They're just like, oh, but when they were 5, it was just like a rando picture that you could barely discern. And then all of a sudden they hit puberty and they're like 11 and 12, and you actually don't even really recognize their actions anymore. You're like, wait, what happened to my child?
What are they doing?
Yeah, what are they doing? So I think your analogy is a good one. I want to bring one other predictability piece, because that's beautiful. And we were talking about this the other night, which is that here's one of the massive benefits that I've experienced personally around the team piece, building a team of people that are around for years, not just months, or around, some of the members of our team that have been around for 5 years. The value goes so far beyond now student retention. Like, I mentioned in a previous episode, one of our drum teachers, Davis, his student retention is off the charts. It's 98%. Like, he doesn't ever lose students anymore, right? That's not even an issue for him, right, at this stage of the game. Cool, box checked. But his value is so massive now around our long-term objectives and new business ideas, and just areas that we truly want to improve as a company that are bigger than the week-to-week, month-to-month operating of a school. So, for example, right now we are about to open a brand new location, and there's so many cool opportunities around a new location. Like, we're exploring things like what types of live events we're going to do now that we'd never done before. And someone like Davis is just incredibly thoughtful around helping to design and brainstorm all of these creative opportunities that we may take advantage of in the future. And having those people on your team that have been through so many of the years together that you can then know and trust to build something new, or introduce new ideas, new classes, even new teaching methods that you didn't dare do before. That's Daniel, that's a massive benefit to me as a founder. Because you and I have talked about this before, but it's friggin' lonely sometimes. When the buck stops with you and you have to make the choice, like you said, you put it so perfectly, by the way, when you said that 1099 to W-2 is just a moment in time. It's a research. Then you make a choice and you put the systems in place to support that choice. That's a moment in time, and then you move forward. It's not like an existential crisis. You're not constantly thinking about it year in, year out. We made the choice to go to W-2 back in like 2013 or 12 or something. It was a moment in time, and that's it. I've never questioned it since. We just move forward. That's now the model we do. There's so many other things to conceive of and to work on and to spend our creative time on.